is the reason why we have autism or obesity or diabetes or all of these non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, that kind of stuff. I think that I think the people who are calling for big changes are largely meanwhile. They think that they know what they're talking about, but they don't. It would be like the Lancet publishes all of this stuff about, the great food transformation and how we should ban pesticides and we don't like GMOs and we should go do agroecology and all of this stuff. I can't imagine how a group of physicians would react if farmers went to the Farmer's Almanac, for example, and said, well, antihypertensive medicines have side effects. And so we think antihypertensive medicines, because they don't make us feel good, should be banned. Well, that's not.
I mean, I think that one of the reasons, and it was hard for me to see when I was inside of the corporation, like when I was working for Monsanto, the motivations of the people on the outside, because I would look at them and be like, what you're doing appears to be evil, right? Mm-hmm. If you're telling everyone don't use genetically engineered crops, or these pesticides that are produced aren't safe, when all of the evidence says it, I really had a very firm idea that they were evil. I'm coming to the conclusion that I think many of our problems in the country right now is a massive lack of meaning. And I think that people are trying to find causes bigger than themselves that they're able to latch onto, and in any type of group that you're going to join, if the group is going to have any sort of longevity, you have to give things up. Every single religion you would look at that has staying power, every cult that ever got to some strength, they had purity rituals.
That's exactly
and those
right.
Purity rituals, whether or not the rest of the world understands why they're doing it, or even if their reasoning isn't correct, it's that it allows you to have an in-group and an out-group. And I think this would be happening at any time in history, no matter what, even though all of the good that's coming with it, it's because people have to make sacrifices in order to have an in-group and an out-group.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. The problem with this, though, is that if you think about it, agriculture is the foundation of civilization. So when some guy or girl 10,000 years ago planted a thatch of wheat in the Mesopotamian river basin, they liberated people from a hunting, gathering, scraping by society to being able to build cities and libraries and things that you and I can sit here and have this conversation because we're fed, right? And the scientific, so we have 10,000 years of organic farming under our belts experience and 50 years of food security in the West. And that is because of scientific advances that are so significant in agriculture. But people aren't aware of those scientific advances in agriculture.
But I think it is actually more nuanced than this. Mm-hmm. And I would point to the evidence of pigs, mm-hmm. right? So people don't realize that pork is the largest consumed meat in the world. 36, mm-hmm. I think, % of all the meat eaten in the world is pork. But 2 out of the major 3 religions don't eat pork at all, right?
You're right?
And you could look at them and you could say, look how much easier it would have been if you would have had pork this whole time. You could have had meat. You could have, gotten rid of all kinds of diseases that come with, the avian, the chicken production. And yet they didn't but I think it was a factor around this sacrifice puts us in an in-group versus an out-group. And that in-group allows us to be much stronger than we would be if we didn't have these food purity concepts.
Exactly, which brings me to Trofim Lysenko.
Okay,
so do you know who Trofim Lysenko is?
No idea.
Okay, so Trofim Lysenko was the agriculture minister under Joseph Stalin.
Ooh, whoa,
okay. Yeah, so he was very interesting. So let's just sort of back up very, very briefly. So in 1905, there was a dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution. There was an uprising, and it was brutally put down, but the prime minister at the time, Peter Stolypin, was wondering what was causing this, what was causing all this unrest, and realized that something needed to be done. And it had been a largely peasant uprising, and they were very upset about the fact that they were essentially doing slave labor. People who held land, they had to work on the land. They couldn't keep their own food. They had to, deliver it to other people. Peter Stolupin did a land grant program, very much like land grant programs here, whereby they were able to get a little plot of land, and as long as they took classes and learned how to farm that land productively, the loan would be forgiven and they could have that. So at the dawn of the Russian, so that's 1906, so 12 years later, at the dawn of the Russian Revolution, that group of people who became known as the kulaks were feeding up to 50% of the Russian population in a 12-year period.
Yeah, they were good at it. They were really good at it. And they were able to sell their crops.
And so they made money. And so they were perceived by the Bolsheviks as being, bourgeoisie. And they were massacred. They were sent off to the Gulag. The name of the massacre was called the Holodomor. So it was largely happened in the Ukraine. And then huge food shortages and things like that. So that was under Lenin and the program that they had for kulaks. Stalin then comes in the early 1920s when Lenin dies, and installs a person by the name of Trofim Lysenko as his Minister of Agriculture. And Trofim Lysenko did not believe in genetics, and basically falsified his findings and said that he could grow wheat under really, really extraordinary circumstances.
Take it out full screen.
And then he wound up promoting this idea that was totally non-scientific, no science to base it, and took on Nikolai Vladimov, who was the premier plant scientist of his time, who he sent to the Gulag. And it's Vladimov, who came up with the idea of a seed bank and genetics, died in the Gulag. 50 million Russians starved because of Lysenko's policies. And then when Mao came to power in China and adopted Lysenko's farm policies, another 50 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. So anti-science, even coming from very high people, especially if it affects agriculture, has an outsized impact on food security. And food security is a really important thing to be careful with.
I mean, I completely see what you're saying, and I remember the first time I ever heard about the kulaks, and that really woke me up. In fact, I was probably 2 years into working at Monsanto. I had heard the story of the kulaks, and the parallel that I drew was people that are saying GMOs are poison, or organic farming is safe and the other ones aren't, are putting us in a really bad spot, particularly the corporations that are selling into this system. Because what they're doing is they're taking money and making it off of this fear that people have of hey, maybe our food is poisoned or it's not safe. And then what are you going to do if that fear really starts on fire? If you have somebody come to power that says this is the only way we're going to do it. And I still feel like that's a grave danger in our society. I also think the idea that scientists, I believe we run a very real risk of saying we should have all of our decisions based on science, and we start moving towards a scientism, a sort of religious movement. Correct. That says that science can tell us more than just what is true or is not true, but it also should tell us what we ought to do about it. I think they call it Hume's guillotine, right? Where it's saying this is what the science says is safe, and so therefore we can use that to determine what we ought to do on some large scale. So I'm always like this tension I didn't used to have, and now I do, because I think we're watching what happens when science gets turned into a religion and people start fighting over ideology when one side perceives we're fighting over truth, but that's every religious fight. That's
right. And I think that scientific ideas, scientific discussions, most most recently have been demonstrated to be certain ideologies. If you were on one side or the other, instead of having a reasonable scientific discussion between the people who are defending the use of one thing versus another, in COVID, for example, or people having a reasonable discussion, they got railroaded into one or the other sides, and a whole lot of mistrust built up around those sides. And you, depending on where you stood on hydroxychloroquine versus vaccination versus ivermectin, you're, instead of having a reasonable discussion where people come to a consensus together and build trust, you got automatically labeled as a fascist or a communist. So it's really, I think, for the public to watch this debacle happen at the scientific level is really disconcerting, and they don't know who to believe anymore.
Yeah, 100%. I remember it was a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was The Daily Show or if it was like one of these late night shows. And they did this demonstration where they said, here are 99 people in a band and one that is not in the band. He's playing off on his own. And because these 99 are so loud and they play so well together, this represents the consensus on climate change. And so you're either with the 99 band players or you're this one person over here. And that, like, it really made me angry.
Yeah.
And it really made me be like, you know what? I don't want to be on your team if the way that you're going to win this argument is by saying, look at all the people that agree with us, and whatever this one person's point is, not only are we not going to listen to it, but you should drown them out. You should literally play your music so loud that there's no chance. Because it's like, what if that guy brings a good point to this discussion? What if in his disagreeability, like, he brings something up that nobody considered? Without that guy. Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.